Imagine you are a German soldier in the winter of 1942, standing ankle-deep in the frozen mud of the Eastern Front. You and your comrades are exhausted, half-starved, and relying on supply lines that stretch thin across conquered territory. Your officers constantly remind you that Germany is the most advanced military machine in the world. But then, you see something that doesn't make sense. Soviet troops, the very enemy you are told is primitive and underdeveloped, are driving sleek, sturdy American-made trucks. Thousands of them. One German soldier later wrote in disbelief, "Wherever we turned, the Red Army had American vehicles. We could not understand how the Soviets, who we believed to be technologically backward, possessed such modern transport in such numbers." This shock was not an isolated incident. By the end of World War II, the United States had shipped more than 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. For many German soldiers, this was one of the most confusing and demoralizing aspects of the war. How their enemy, supposedly on its knees, could move so fast, supply so reliably, and fight so fiercely. The answer lay not only in Soviet grit and determination, but in the unprecedented industrial and logistical might of the United States. But to understand this story, we must step back to the early years of the war. When Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, he expected a quick campaign. The German High Command believed the Soviet Union would collapse in a matter of months under the weight of the Blitzkrieg. Instead, they found themselves locked in a brutal, grinding conflict against a nation that refused to surrender. The Soviets were vast in manpower but short on modern equipment. They had factories, yes, but many were hastily relocated east of the Urals, away from German bombers. Production in 1941 and 1942 was chaotic and slow. Trucks, in particular, were a nightmare for the Soviets. Their army depended heavily on horse-drawn wagons to move supplies, while the Germans had motorized divisions. Yet, by late 1942 and early 1943, the Red Army's logistics seemed transformed. German units noticed that Soviet offensives were moving with unprecedented speed. Supplies of ammunition, food, and reinforcements were flowing across muddy roads that had previously swallowed wagons whole. Even in harsh weather, Soviet divisions could reposition quickly. This mobility shocked the Germans, because mobility was supposed to be their own great advantage. The secret, though not fully realized by German soldiers at the time, was the American truck. Through the Lend-Lease program, the United States had begun sending vast amounts of war material to the Soviet Union. Ships braved treacherous Arctic convoys to reach ports like Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Trains carried supplies across Siberia from Vladivostok, and among the crates of rifles, food, boots, and raw materials came hundreds of thousands of trucks, Studebakers, GMCs, Dodges, and Fords. At first, these shipments seemed almost symbolic. In 1941, only small numbers reached Soviet hands. But as America's industrial machine roared into full production, the numbers skyrocketed. By 1943, convoys of American trucks were arriving in droves. The Soviets quickly realized their immense value. Unlike the unreliable and often primitive Soviet trucks, these American vehicles were durable, easy to repair, and could handle rough terrain. Soldiers nicknamed them the real soldiers of victory. To German eyes, this was a betrayal of reality itself. They believed their war was a clash of ideologies, fascism against communism. Yet here was the capitalist superpower of the West propping up their communist enemy. For frontline German troops, who faced the consequences directly, it was both baffling and demoralizing. One veteran of the Wehrmacht recalled, "We thought the Bolsheviks were beaten. But then came these convoys of trucks, more and more of them. They gave the Russians a mobility we could not match." But from Washington's perspective, the decision made perfect sense. President Franklin Roosevelt had declared America the arsenal of democracy. The Lend-Lease program was designed to ensure that the Allies, Britain, China, and the Soviet Union, could keep fighting, while America's factories supplied them. For the U.S., it was cheaper to send trucks than to send divisions of soldiers. And trucks, as it turned out, could be just as decisive as tanks in shaping the outcome of the war. In the coming chapters, We will uncover just how vital these trucks were, how they helped the Soviets move artillery, tow tanks, supply food, and even mount rocket launchers, how entire Soviet offensives, from Stalingrad to Berlin, relied on wheels made in Detroit and shipped across oceans, and how, in the words of Marshal Zhukov himself, the war was won with American trucks. For now, imagine again that German soldier on the Eastern Front. He looks across the battlefield, expecting to see Soviet wagons and horses struggling through the mud. Instead, he sees convoys of Studebakers, tough, roaring engines carrying supplies to the front with relentless speed. To him, it feels like the ground itself has shifted beneath his feet. He does not yet know that behind those trucks lies the vast industrial heart of America, capable of producing more than the world has ever seen. By the end of 1941, the Soviet Union was fighting for survival. The German blitzkrieg had driven deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies and capturing millions of prisoners. Cities like Smolensk and Kiev had fallen, and German troops were at the gates of Moscow. The Red Army was bleeding. Supplies were scarce, food was short, and soldiers often lacked even the basics of boots and winter clothing. It was during this desperate moment that the first American aid began to arrive. In October 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt extended the Lend-Lease program, originally created to support Britain, to include the Soviet Union. To many Americans, the decision seemed strange, even contradictory. How could the United States, a capitalist democracy, now aid the communist state that only months earlier had signed a pact with Hitler? But Roosevelt was not thinking about ideology. He was thinking about survival. If the Soviet Union collapsed, Germany would control the resources of all Eastern Europe and push its war machine toward Britain and beyond. The United States could not allow that. As Roosevelt famously said, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil." The enemy of America's enemy was, for now, a necessary ally. And so began one of the most ambitious logistical undertakings in history. The question was not whether America could produce the supplies. Its factories were already shifting into high gear, but how to deliver them to a country as vast, as distant, and as embattled as the Soviet Union. There were three main routes. The first was the most dangerous, the Arctic convoys. Ships would leave ports in Britain and America, sail around the icy waters of Norway, and head toward Murmansk or Arkhangelsk. These routes were brutally exposed. German submarines prowled beneath the waves, Luftwaffe bombers attacked from above, and surface ships, like the battleship Tirpitz, threatened the convoys. Sailors who served on those missions later called it the worst journey in the world. But it was also the fastest way to get trucks, tanks, and other supplies into the Soviet heartland. The second route was the Persian Corridor. Supplies landed in ports in Iran, then traveled by rail and rode north into the Soviet Union. This path was safer than the Arctic seas but slower, and it required building infrastructure across deserts and mountains. American engineers even upgraded railroads in Iran to handle the flood of war goods. The third route was through the Pacific, across the ocean to Vladivostok. Technically, the United States was not yet at war with Japan before December 1941, so Japanese ships allowed the passage of goods. But this route, too, was complicated and vulnerable. Trucks, however, became a priority cargo. Unlike tanks or airplanes, trucks were not glamorous. They didn't make headlines. Yet Soviet commanders quickly understood that without trucks, offensives stalled. A tank might win a battle, but a truck won the campaign by ensuring fuel, food, and ammunition actually reached the front. When the first Studebakers and GMCs rolled into Soviet hands, the reaction was astonishment. Soviet drivers were used to temperamental, breakdown-prone vehicles that rattled over every bump. The American trucks, by contrast, were durable, smooth, and easy to maintain. They could handle mud, snow, and frozen ground in ways Soviet models could not. Soldiers began to call them Lend-Leasovsky, Lend-Lease trucks, and soon developed a deep respect for their reliability. But getting them into Soviet hands was anything but easy. German U-boats sank thousands of tons of cargo. Entire convoys were lost in the Arctic night. The men who crewed the convoys often froze at their posts, battling not only German fire, but also towering seas and ice storms. Every Studebaker that reached the Red Army came at the price of human lives and unimaginable risk. Despite this, the scale of deliveries grew. Between 1941 and 1942, only modest numbers of trucks arrived, sometimes only a few thousand a month. But as American industry ramped up, the numbers surged. By 1943, tens of thousands were arriving annually. The Soviets began to reorganize their logistics to take advantage of this new mobility. Where once horse-drawn carts clogged the muddy roads, now convoys of green-painted American trucks pushed supplies forward with mechanical reliability. For the Germans, who prided themselves on mobility and mechanization, this was a bitter irony. They had assumed their enemy would remain stuck in the mud of backwardness. Instead, they now faced Soviet divisions supplied with better trucks than many of their own units. The balance of logistics was shifting. In the words of one German officer captured at Stalingrad, "We thought the Bolsheviks had nothing left, but they moved faster than we ever imagined. Only later did I learn that their trucks came from America." The Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, had found a lifeline across the oceans, and the trucks, pouring in through convoys and corridors, were about to play a decisive role in turning the tide of the war. By the summer of 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had reached its bloodiest stage. Hitler, frustrated by his failure to capture Moscow in 1941, turned his army south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga. It was a campaign meant not only to secure vital resources, but also to crush Soviet morale by capturing the city that bore Stalin's name. As German divisions pushed east, the Soviet Union scrambled to reinforce its lines. The Red Army had learned from the disasters of 1941. Soldiers were now better prepared, and commanders had begun reorganizing their forces to absorb the lessons of modern war. Still, they faced a persistent problem: mobility. A Soviet rifle division might receive a handful of trucks, but more often, its supplies were carried by horses or by the men themselves, dragging sleds and carts through mud and snow. Ammunition and fuel often arrived late, slowing down counterattacks. Stalin and his generals knew that to resist the German assault at Stalingrad, they needed more than bravery and numbers. They needed movement. That movement arrived in the form of American trucks. The Studebaker US6, in particular, became legendary among Soviet troops. It was not flashy, not heavily armed, but it was sturdy and versatile. Its all-wheel drive allowed it to traverse the muddy steppe and frozen fields that had crippled German operations. Soviet soldiers quickly learned to trust it. One commander remarked, "The Studebaker starts in the morning, even when the frost is 40 below. Our own trucks do not." As the Germans hammered Stalingrad with artillery and bombs, Soviet logistics, quietly powered by American vehicles, kept the defenders supplied. Ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements crossed the Volga under fire, and trucks carried supplies right up to the river's edge. When the Soviet High Command prepared its great counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, the trucks became even more essential. In November 1942, the Red Army struck back, encircling the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. It was one of the most daring maneuvers of the war. Entire Soviet armies had to move quickly across rough terrain to seal the trap. Thousands of American-made trucks carried men, artillery, and supplies into position. Without that mobility, the encirclement would have been far more difficult, perhaps even impossible. German officers later captured at Stalingrad expressed disbelief at the speed of the Soviet counterattack. To them, the Red Army had always seemed sluggish, reliant on manpower rather than machines. But now they faced a foe that could maneuver with surprising speed. What they did not know at the time was that behind that speed were convoys of Lend-Lease trucks grinding steadily through the mud. If Stalingrad proved that the Red Army could stand and strike back, the Battle of Kursk in 1943 proved that it could launch massive offensive operations. Kursk was the largest tank battle in history, with nearly 6,000 armored vehicles clashing across the Russian steppe. It was here that trucks once again showed their hidden power. Soviet commanders had constructed massive defensive belts, mines, trenches, anti-tank guns, stretching for miles. To keep those defenses supplied, and to move reserves at lightning speed, they relied on American trucks. Studebakers hauled anti-tank guns into position, brought ammunition forward, and evacuated wounded soldiers under fire. When the Soviets shifted from defense to offense after blunting the German attack, their ability to move entire armies forward was critical. Once again, the convoys of trucks gave the Red Army a mobility edge it had lacked in 1941. German troops, who still relied heavily on horses for supply, often found themselves outpaced. One frustrated German report admitted, "The Russians move faster than we can follow. Their supplies appear to be endless." The truth was that those supplies were not endless. They were arriving in staggering numbers from factories across the Atlantic. By 1943, American production was reaching its stride. Shipments of trucks to the USSR multiplied, filling the roads with Studebakers, GMCs, and Dodges. To the average Soviet soldier, it was simply a miracle. Supplies arrived on time, reinforcements could move quickly, and retreats could be managed with far less chaos than before. There was another, often overlooked, aspect of the truck's contribution at Kursk, the towing of artillery. Soviet guns, from light anti-tank pieces to heavy howitzers, could be moved rapidly into new positions by American vehicles. This allowed Soviet artillery, the god of war, as Stalin called it, to concentrate fire with devastating effect. By the time the Germans retreated from Kursk, their last great offensive in the east had failed. From that moment on, the Red Army would push westward, never again to lose the strategic initiative. And behind every advance, behind every victorious push, the rumble of trucks could be heard, a mechanical heartbeat that kept the vast Soviet war machine alive. German prisoners often remarked on this transformation. In 1941, one remembered, "We saw Russians pulling guns with horses." In 1943, they had trucks, and they never seemed to stop moving. It was a subtle change, one not always captured in history books. But for the soldiers who lived it, the difference was night and day. The trucks did not fire a single shot, but they delivered the firepower of an entire army. And as the Soviets drove the Germans back, mile by mile, town by town, those trucks became symbols of endurance and victory. Proof that sometimes the war is won not only by the men at the front, but by the machines that carry them there. After Kursk, the momentum of the war shifted permanently. No longer fighting just to survive, the Red Army now carried the war westward, pushing the Germans back across the vast plains of Ukraine and toward Eastern Europe. But victory on such a scale required more than courage or tanks. It required the ability to move entire armies across hundreds of miles of destroyed roads, rivers, and battle-scarred landscapes. And that is where the American trucks truly began to show their worth. The Soviet Union was enormous, stretching thousands of miles from the Ural Mountains to the borders of Poland. Railways, though extensive, had been shattered by German occupation and constant bombing. Bridges were blown apart, lines were sabotaged, and locomotives were scarce. The Red Army faced a daunting problem. How could they supply millions of soldiers advancing across such vast distances without grinding to a halt? The answer came in the form of convoys. Endless convoys. By 1944, American trucks, particularly the Studebaker US6, were arriving in such massive numbers that they transformed Soviet supply lines into something the Germans had never imagined possible. Instead of relying primarily on horses, the Red Army now had motorized columns stretching for miles. These trucks carried food, ammunition, fuel, artillery, and men at a speed the Wehrmacht could not match. German soldiers noticed the difference immediately. One officer wrote in his diary after the battles in Ukraine, "The Russians seem to have an inexhaustible supply of vehicles. Their columns move day and night. When we think we have destroyed their logistics, more arrive, as if from nowhere." In reality, they were arriving from America. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and South Bend were working around the clock, producing machines not for American soldiers, but for their Soviet allies. By war's end, nearly 500,000 trucks would cross the oceans, carried in Liberty ships, braving U-boat-infested waters to reach the Soviet front. For the Red Army, this meant a revolution in mobility. Entire divisions could now redeploy in days rather than weeks. Artillery could be moved forward quickly to smash German positions. Fuel, so critical for tanks like the T-34, flowed in steady streams, keeping Soviet armored thrusts from stalling. The offensive operations of 1944, the Great Liberation of Ukraine, Operation Bagration in Belarus, and the March into Poland were all powered, quite literally, by the steady hum of Lend-Lease trucks. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, provides one of the clearest examples. In this massive offensive, the Red Army shattered the German Army Group Center, inflicting one of the greatest defeats in German military history. Soviet armies advanced over 400 miles in just 2 months. The sheer scale of the operation demanded logistical coordination on a level the Red Army had never before achieved. American trucks made it possible. They delivered ammunition to the front faster than German troops could consume their own supplies. They transported fuel that kept the armored spearheads moving. They carried bridging equipment to cross rivers, engineers to repair roads, and food to feed millions of hungry soldiers. The Germans, by contrast, still moved much of their supplies by horse-drawn wagons, which bogged down in mud and could not keep pace with the fast-moving front lines. A German prisoner captured during Bagration recalled with disbelief, "We had always thought of the Russians as clumsy, slow, and tied to their railways. But suddenly, they were everywhere. Their columns of vehicles stretched farther than we could see. We could not understand how they had so many." For Soviet soldiers, the change was equally shocking. Many remembered the desperate marches of 1941 and 1942, when they had to carry their equipment on their backs or load it onto sledges, pulled by starving horses. Now they rode in trucks, their weapons stacked neatly in the back, while convoys roared toward the front. What had once been exhaustion and misery became a kind of grim efficiency. The impact extended beyond logistics. Trucks also gave the Red Army new tactical options. They could move infantry rapidly to exploit breakthroughs, turning a small gap in the German line into a full collapse. They could withdraw troops under pressure without losing entire formations. And they could coordinate multi-front offensives over hundreds of miles, something that had been impossible in the early years of the war. By late 1944, German commanders understood that the war in the East was no longer one of equals. Not only did the Soviets outnumber them, but they were now outsupplying and outmoving them as well. Horses against motorized convoys, dwindling fuel against endless shipments, desperation against industrial might. It was a contest Germany could not win. What made it even more bitter for German soldiers was the irony. They had long dismissed the Soviet Union as backward and primitive, a land of peasants and mud. But now those same peasants were advancing westward, carried by American trucks, built in gleaming factories the Germans had once ridiculed. As the Red Army swept into Eastern Europe, villages and towns that had suffered under Nazi occupation cheered their liberation. And behind every cheer, behind every tank rolling forward, was a convoy of Lend-Lease trucks grinding over the battered roads. They were the silent companions of victory, machines that never fired a bullet, yet carried the weight of an empire's revenge. By the beginning of 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final act. The Red Army, having rolled through Belarus and liberated much of Eastern Europe, now stood on the banks of the Vistula River in Poland, staring westward toward the heart of the Reich. Between them and Berlin lay hundreds of miles of destroyed infrastructure, hostile weather, and desperate German defenses. Yet when the Soviet offensive began, it moved with a speed and coordination that left German soldiers stunned. The key once again was mobility, and at the center of that mobility were American trucks. The Soviet Union, though vast and rich in manpower, still struggled with transportation at the war's outset. But by 1944 and 1945, with hundreds of thousands of Studebakers, GMCs, and Dodges flooding into their supply chains, the Red Army had become a mechanized giant. It was not only tanks like the T-34 or heavy artillery that gave them their edge. It was the ability to move those weapons swiftly and to keep them supplied across immense distances. The Vistula Oder offensive in January 1945 demonstrated this transformation with brutal clarity. Soviet forces launched a massive assault across a front of more than 400 miles, smashing through German defenses and advancing nearly 300 miles in just over 3 weeks. To German soldiers, it felt like a tidal wave. Reports from the front described endless Soviet columns moving westward. Trucks carried infantry, ammunition, fuel, bridging equipment, and even horses to keep the advance flexible. One German survivor later recalled, "We could not believe the scale. Day after day, their trucks kept coming, loaded with everything they needed. We destroyed bridges, blew up roads, but still they advanced. They had more vehicles than we could ever imagine." The Wehrmacht, by this stage, was collapsing. Its once proud divisions were shadows of themselves, short on fuel, supplies, and mobility. Horses still dragged much of their equipment. In contrast, the Soviets seemed unstoppable. When one column paused, another appeared behind it. When German troops thought they had disrupted the enemy's supply lines, convoys of Studebakers rumbled in to restore them. The effect on German morale was devastating. Soldiers who had once believed in the superiority of German engineering now faced a foe powered by the industrial might of both the Soviet Union and the United States. They watched as Soviet infantry arrived in trucks rather than on foot, as artillery pieces were hauled rapidly into position, as tanks were refueled on the move. The war of attrition Germany had once hoped to win was now hopelessly one-sided. The scale of the logistics effort was staggering. A single Soviet front, equivalent to a Western Army group, might contain over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and tens of thousands of artillery pieces. To keep such a force supplied required tens of thousands of truckloads each day. Soviet trucks alone could never have managed it. With American Lend-Lease, however, the impossible became achievable. In Poland, liberated villages saw columns of vehicles stretching beyond the horizon. To civilians who had endured years of Nazi occupation, it was a surreal sight. Soldiers riding in trucks with American markings, speaking Russian, singing Red Army songs. For them, the vehicles symbolized liberation and the unstoppable advance of history. German soldiers, meanwhile, were left in disbelief. One officer captured during the Vistula Oder campaign told his interrogators, "We were shocked at how fast the Russians could move. It was not like 1941 anymore. They struck like lightning, and we had no chance to regroup. We thought they had endless reserves." The truth was not endless reserves, but efficient supply lines. Trucks carried spare parts, food, fuel, even mobile workshops to repair damaged equipment on the spot. The Soviet war machine had become self-sustaining on the move, something it had never been before. As the Red Army crossed into German soil, the effect grew even more profound. Villages that once saw horse-drawn wagons now shook from the roar of convoys. German civilians, peering from shattered houses, saw that this was not a primitive, ragtag army. It was an industrial juggernaut, powered in part by the factories of Detroit and Chicago. For the Germans at the front, it felt hopeless. Some units surrendered at the first sign of encirclement. Others tried to retreat, only to be overtaken by faster Soviet forces transported by truck. The Wehrmacht's mobility, once one of its greatest strengths, had been eclipsed. By the time Soviet forces reached the Oder River, just 40 miles from Berlin, the outcome of the war was clear. German soldiers no longer asked if they could hold the Soviets back. They asked only how long it would take before the tidal wave swept over them completely. And in the background of this final advance, behind the thunder of tanks and the crash of artillery, was the constant hum of engines, the sound of hundreds of thousands of trucks that carried the Red Army to the gates of Berlin. The true measure of America's contribution was not in the numbers written on shipping manifests, but in the dust clouds raised across the endless steppes of Russia. To understand why these 400,000 trucks were such a game-changer, one must step onto the Eastern Front in 1943 and see the Red Army in motion. The German Wehrmacht had built its legend on speed, the Blitzkrieg. Fast-moving panzer divisions, supplied by horse-drawn carts and supported by a disciplined rail network, had cut through Europe like a knife. But when the front shifted to the vast plains of the Soviet Union, this system buckled. Germany's reliance on horses meant their supply columns crawled behind their tanks. The further east they went, the more overextended they became. Ammunition, fuel, and food arrived late or not at all. Tanks stood idle for lack of fuel. Soldiers went hungry. Blitzkrieg slowed to a crawl. The Soviets, ironically, had started the war in an even worse position. In 1941, The Red Army's logistics were primitive. Soldiers marched on foot, artillery was dragged by horses, and supplies often failed to arrive. Stalin himself acknowledged that we were short of everything. But by 1943, as American trucks began arriving in bulk, a silent revolution occurred behind the lines. Suddenly, Soviet infantry could be carried forward in convoys instead of marching until their boots disintegrated. Artillery could be towed at speed to the front lines. Food and ammunition could arrive on time. One of the most famous trucks, the Studebaker US6, became the backbone of this transformation. Soviet soldiers adored it. Nicknamed Studer, it could handle mud, snow, and bitter cold that often paralyzed German vehicles. While Wehrmacht supply lines bogged down in swamps and frozen roads, the Studebakers powered through. They became the workhorses of the Red Army, hauling everything from Katyusha rocket launchers to barrels of fuel. This meant the Soviets could do something the Germans could not: sustain momentum. At Kursk, in July 1943, when the largest tank battle in history erupted, Soviet forces didn't just defend, they counterattacked. After years of retreat, they suddenly had the ability to move men and machines rapidly across the battlefield. Trucks delivered fresh troops and ammunition in hours instead of days. German commanders, stunned, asked themselves how the Red Army could replace losses so quickly. The answer often came on four wheels, painted in olive drab, stamped "Made in USA." But the impact was not just tactical, it was strategic. Soviet offensives, such as Operation Bagration in 1944, demonstrated a logistical capability that had once been unthinkable. In this operation, the Red Army destroyed Germany's Army Group Center, advancing hundreds of miles in weeks. Soviet commanders credited their new mobility, enabled by Lend-Lease trucks. Without them, such deep penetrations into German lines would have been impossible. The Studebaker convoys became lifelines that carried the war into the heart of Europe. German soldiers on the ground noticed it too. In memoirs and letters, they wrote bitterly about the endless columns of American trucks carrying Soviet troops past them. To a German soldier trudging through the mud, seeing the Red Army racing forward on vehicles supplied by his enemy was demoralizing. It symbolized not only the strength of Soviet manpower, but also the industrial might of the Allies, working together in a way Germany could not match. One German officer famously remarked, "The Allies fight with machines. We fight with men." It was both an observation and a lament. The Wehrmacht's failure to mechanize its logistics meant it was trapped in a 19th century supply system, while its enemies fought a 20th century war. For Soviet soldiers, however, these trucks were more than machines. They were symbols of survival. Soldiers remembered how in the early years of the war, reinforcements often arrived too late, exhausted from days of marching. Now they arrived rested, ready to fight. Supplies that once failed to reach the front now came in reliable convoys. The Red Army slogan of the time, "Everything for victory," was made possible by wheels that came from across the ocean. And yet, at the time, this contribution was rarely acknowledged. Soviet propaganda minimized American aid, portraying victory as a purely Soviet achievement. To admit dependence on foreign trucks didn't fit Stalin's narrative of Russian resilience. Only decades later would Russian veterans openly admit how vital the Studebakers and other American vehicles had been. By 1944, the transformation was complete. The Soviet Union had become a mobile war machine. While German divisions were retreating on foot and by horse, the Red Army was storming westward on American steel. The tide of war had turned, and the sound of it was not just the rumble of tanks or the roar of artillery. It was the hum of hundreds of thousands of truck engines, carrying an army toward Berlin. As the guns of World War II finally fell silent in May 1945, the world looked upon a Europe reduced to rubble and a Soviet Union scarred but victorious. Yet beneath the glory and blood, one of the war's quietest revolutions had rolled on four wheels. The 400,000 trucks that America had supplied to the Soviet Union were more than tools of war. They had become instruments of victory, and their legacy would stretch far beyond the battlefield. For the Soviets, victory had come at a staggering cost. Over 20 million dead, cities destroyed, farms burned, families broken. But one of the few constants across those years of chaos was the steady flow of vehicles arriving in convoys across the Arctic, Iran, and the Pacific. These machines, built in Detroit, Ohio, and Indiana, had been driven across oceans to keep the Red Army moving. The Studebaker US6, in particular, became a legend. Soviet soldiers recalled that without it, many offensives would have been impossible. Its durability in the mud of spring, the snow of winter, and the dust of summer made it more than just a truck. It was a trusted companion. Some Soviet veterans would later joke, "The Americans gave us Studebakers, and we gave them victory." It was an exaggeration, of course, but one rooted in truth. The trucks did not disappear after the war. Many continued to serve in the Red Army for years. In fact, photographs from the 1950s still show Soviet soldiers riding in American-supplied vehicles. Some were even adapted for civilian use, helping rebuild the devastated Soviet economy. Farmers used them to haul grain. Workers used them to transport materials, and they became a strange symbol of how foreign steel had helped restore a broken land. For the Germans who had fought against these machines, the memory was bitter. Captured diaries often reflected disbelief that the Red Army had been so well equipped while their own supply lines collapsed. One German soldier wrote, "It felt as though we were fighting not just Russia, but all the factories of the world." That perception was not far from reality. The trucks embodied the idea that America's industrial might could reach the farthest battlefields, reshaping the balance of power. And yet, for decades, the story of Lend-Lease aid remained suppressed inside the Soviet Union. Stalin, determined to frame victory as a wholly Soviet achievement, minimized the role of foreign assistance. Official histories downplayed the trucks, the food, the planes, and the tanks that had arrived from overseas. To admit dependence on America would have dented the carefully crafted image of self-reliance. For the Soviet people, the truth became a whispered memory. Soldiers who had ridden in Studebakers remembered, but the textbooks did not. It wasn't until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that Russian historians began to openly discuss the scale of American aid. Veterans spoke with honesty about how the trucks had saved lives, how they had made the difference between starvation and survival, defeat and victory. What Stalin had hidden, history eventually revealed, that the war in the East was won not only by the courage of Soviet soldiers, but also by the wheels delivered from across the ocean. The legacy was not just military or historical. It was also symbolic. The trucks represented something deeper, the strange, uneasy alliance between two very different worlds. The capitalist powerhouse of America and the communist giant of the Soviet Union were ideological enemies. Yet for 4 years, they were bound by necessity. Trucks became the physical evidence of that uneasy cooperation, proof that in the face of a common enemy, even the bitterest rivals could stand side by side. As we look back today, the lesson is clear. Wars are not won by bravery alone. They are won by logistics, by supplies, by the unglamorous machines that carry armies forward. The Soviet soldier with a rifle mattered. The tank at course mattered. But without the trucks that brought ammunition, food, and reinforcements, even the bravest soldier and the strongest tank would have been powerless. So when German soldiers wrote that they couldn't believe America had supplied 400,000 trucks to the Soviets, it wasn't just a note of surprise. It was an acknowledgement of defeat. Those trucks had done more than move men and weapons. They had moved the course of history. And that is the forgotten truth of World War II. Sometimes, the roar of victory does not come from the battlefield itself, but from the steady hum of engines, carrying an army closer and closer to triumph.